state. And as one of the planners or the co-organizers for the conference, one of the things that we sort of really came to is that there is a lot of energy, a lot of people who are wanting to be active, a lot of people who want to resist oppression, resist sort of our death-driven culture. But if we don't really have a good handle on what got us here in the first place, we end up sort of not maybe repeating mistakes that shouldn't necessarily be repeated, or not quite coming up with ideas, or I don't want to say solutions, but ways of engaging the problems that we're trying to sort out. And one of the big things in my work I do, I'm a graphic designer for a seminary where I attended, but I'm also on the anti-racism team there, and I've worked on anti-racism at a couple institutions within my denomination. And one of the things that is really problematic is that people really don't understand how we ended up in the situation where we're at with race and racism, and how it correlates with the nation state. And so in anarchist circles as well, you know, we're sort of talking about the nation state and we're talking about racism here, and we don't always fully understand how interconnected and intertwined they were. I know I did. And so in doing the historical work, learning the importance of history for making sure that we are actually dealing with the issues that we're trying to deal with appropriately. So this presentation is based on an essay that I wrote on the same topic, the Church's Resistance to Racism and Nation, Christian Anarchist Perspective. And there will be a lot of historical information, but I think it's important if we're gonna understand where we are and where we're going. So here it goes. So race, the method of classifying human beings on alleged biological differences, is a science fiction. Yet it remains entrenched in our language, in our institutions, and our societies. And so how is it possible that systems of racial power and privilege continue to strangle societies across the globe when the biology of race has been discounted? Hopefully many people know that the whole idea that there is something intrinsically different between myself and this brother here, or myself and this brother here, that there is something within our DNA that makes us separate, is false. That is just, it's not the case. I am more likely to have DNA markers that match up with this guy here than I would with my sister back there. And so the concept of race as a biological truth is false. But, you know, it continues to persist even without a scientific foundation. And why is that? So what I want to suggest in this presentation is, because race and nation developed simultaneously during the modern period, influencing and informing each other as they evolved, that race and racism will persist as long as nations are the dominant way in which we organize ourselves. It's not the only problem. The development of the nation state is very complicated, but race is one of the sort of keystones to how we begin to understand ourselves in a particular way. As people who are defined by borders, as people who are sort of social groupings who have allegiances to each other beyond kinship, etc., etc. I'll say more. And so what I want to do is to provide a historical sketch. There'll be a lot of names and dates and book titles being thrown at you. You know, sort of absorb what you can, but I think all of it's important. And then I want to do an overview of how those theories form some very concrete parts of what make up a nation right now, and also give some thought on how I think there are particular characteristics within the church that, if we really pay attention and do what we're called to do, can help us to engage those things in a different way. So on to the history. Contrary to popular belief, the concept of race as we know it today is not an age-old idea. It has a born-on date. Instead, it emerged during the modern era as scientific knowledge developed and people from the West began exploring the world beyond their shores. So one of the first people to begin categorizing the diverse people that he was meeting on his trips was a physician named Francois Bernier. And in a paper he published in 1684, he began to begin categorizing 4 or 5 species of races of men in particular, whose difference is so remarkable that it may be properly made use of as the foundation for a new division of the earth. So that's his language. So based on facial features, hair texture, build, and other characteristics, he began to sort of think about, okay, there are 4 kinds of species of people that I'm encountering when I travel. Attributing their differences in skin color to climate, Bernier grouped Indians and Egyptians with Europeans because those, quote, those individuals take care of themselves and are not obliged to expose themselves so often as the lower class, and are not darker than many Spaniards. And so his categories from the beginning begin to show that race describes more than skin tone and physical appearance. It has traditional aristocratic assumptions aligned with it. There's class already at play in the first articulation of who these different people might be. Now, although he was the first to publicly describe people in this way, he didn't use the term very precisely, and he didn't really try to set up a system of sorts. In his writing, race is used as a descriptor primarily. There's not yet the philosophical sort of trying to place people in a hierarchy, but he's the first person that notes these differences, and from him moving forward, people begin to start organizing humanity according to physical traits and personal and class prejudice. And that starts to shift the modern anthropology of how we think of human beings. Prior to that, within sort of Judeo-Christian frameworks, there was more of a biblical genealogy. People really believed that we all came from Adam, and so there is a reluctance to sort of get into this whole, well, maybe we come from different species kind of thing. And so, although I'm not a creationist, it is interesting that a certain kind of biblical worldview for a while helped to stay the sharp divisions between human people. And so while Bernier was dividing humanity into different races, the Enlightenment thinkers were kind of in a very optimistic way of being. And so they thought that all people could become rational and intelligent. All you needed was enough education. The distinctions between these different races weren't really a problem because, you know, we're in the optimistic humanistic mode. Everybody just needs to be trained. Race is determined by climate, and so I'm sure if you move some Negroes from over there to over here, they turn to our skin color after a few generations. It's not a big deal. And so there is this kind of dialectic going on where people are sort of dividing races, but at the same time, there's an Enlightenment thinking that says, okay, there might be these divisions, but it's okay because if everybody gets the right amount of training, we're all blank slates, we can all become more civilized. So the vast majority of racial ideology between 1750 and 1850, quote, upheld the descent of all races from a single original group, and in so doing was in conformity with both a particular understanding of biblical tradition and with the Enlightenment concept of the essential unity of the brotherhood of man. Now, while most race theories in the beginning were moderate in their treatment of non-European people, there's an author, Neil McMaster, who calls that period the humanitarian racism, was not without its problems or its detractors. So some people were already starting to argue that, well, maybe humanity's primitive ancestors were white, and then all the other races developed from a slow and steady decline. Thomas Jefferson rejected the idea of equality among races. He advanced the hypothesis that each race originated from different human types, and he insisted that racial differences were biological. So now you start moving from, wow, I'm noticing all these different people, maybe they're different races, to we're going to start thinking scientifically about why these differences are, and maybe there's something within our biology that makes us different. In spite of this sort of emerging variety, there was a scientist, Blumenbeck, who represents the majority of racial thought still. He is known for dividing human beings into Caucasian, Mongolian, Ethiopian, American, and Malay races. But he still tried to affirm a common human ancestry, and he didn't, there wasn't a racial hierarchy being developed right at that point just yet. Now, by the late 19th century, early race theories had grown increasingly intolerant and more complicated. And so this paradigm shift was already beginning in 1850 when an anatomist insisted, and this is a quote, "Race is everything. Literature, science, art, in a word, civilization depends on it," end quote. In The Races of Men, a book that he wrote, he argued that race is biological, it's hereditary, it's not, can't be altered by climate or anything else external, and that everything about a person, from their intelligence and their physical build to the way they understand freedom, or the way that they understand government, was dictated by their biologically racial category. And so he was so certain that racial characteristics were permanent that he insisted that each race could only thrive in their own native land and their climate. So you already have people beginning to articulate that we should not be mixing. Races should stay wherever they are because that's the only way that they're going to be able to survive. And neither climate nor geography nor any other social or environmental pressures can change one's racial category. So he challenged what he was seeing as flaws in other people's racial theories and was also advancing his own new articulation of race. What was also very interesting about what he did was he began to also subdivide European races. So you have people looking at differences outside. There are these different kind of colored people who live differently from us. But then you have this Robert Knox guy saying, and Europeans are different races too. Saxons are an entirely different race than Celts, like an American is different from a Negro. They're totally different. No interracial mixing between Saxons and Celts, between Germans and Slovenians. They're all different races. And he also begins to classify Jews as a distinct race instead of a religious and a cultural community. And so that shift increases in popularity as anti-Semitism develops throughout this area. Because each race was its own self-contained species, Knox strongly opposed interracial marriage and interracial reproduction as detrimental and unsustainable. And so he sort of identified a law, and I don't know where he got this law from, but that people composed of two or more races were doomed to extinction. The minute that you start doing racial mixing, your race is going to devolve to the point where you become extinct. So that this already is a very different way of thinking about race, even than when Vermeer just started saying, they do different class things than me or whatever. Another thing that was really interesting too that he did was that people began to re-explain history in terms of race. So one of the things that Knox does was, the French and the British in Canada were at war over territory, but he rewrites that story. It's the Celts and the Saxons that were at war, and the Celts are their own race, and they love war and disorder, and they hate order and patient industry, and the Saxons are natural democrats with the best understanding of liberty, and really that's why they're fighting. It's not a contest over territory, it's a contest between two races who have certain inherent characteristics that have to fight each other until they become extinct, because races cannot intermix. So politics and conquest begins to be reinterpreted with a racial lens. And this is very important as we sort of see how nations begin to think about themselves. Now in 1870, there was a definitive shift to an even more radical and modern form of racism, which was characterized in part by white Europeans, and this is a quote, anxiety about its own racial substance and a fear of physical degeneration. So you have, and I try and think about this because when you're doing this research and you're a woman of color and you start reading this stuff, it's like, really honest? Come on. But the way that I think about it is like, it's almost akin to global warming. And I'm not saying that global warming is not real, so that's not the point that I'm making. But everything about, if you're a conscious person, we're always thinking about the planet. We're thinking about the way in which the planet might become extinct, what we need to do in order to make sure that doesn't happen. We do recycling, we do this, we buy local, etc. It governs the way that our lives are lived. And that's the situation that people were living in 1850 around race. Who can I sleep with that's not going to destroy my entire civilization? You know, who can I live with? When you have races, distinct races that look like you, and there's the threat of physical degeneration. Are you a Celt or are you a Saxon? I mean, that is the way in which people are living, and their social structures are beginning to be organized with that kind of oppressive thinking always in the back of their mind. How do we make sure that we keep our superior races strong, and how do we make sure we don't fall off the planet and human beings become extinct? And that's a mindset that's hard to get into, but I think it's important for understanding. It's not just a few people here and there who are thinking this stuff. It begins to saturate all of these different European societies, saturate the colonies, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a particular person, Galton, in a book he wrote, Hereditary Genius, who is already beginning to think about what we need to do to preserve ourselves from this catastrophe. And so from his vantage point, and this is a quote, the needs of centralization, communication, and culture call for more brains and mental stamina than the average of our race possess. We are in crying want for a greater fund of ability in all stations of life. Our race is overweighted and appears likely to be drudged into degeneracy by demands that exceed its power. And so one of the ideas that he had for preserving his European race from extinction was that members of the race who were a little bit superior needed to marry and have children at a faster rate than weaker ones. Over time, the elite would produce more generations within a given period, and therefore the growth of a prolific race would be vastly increased. And if those classes refused this responsibility, it would, quote, cause the race of the prudent to fall into an almost incredible inferiority of numbers, bring utter ruin upon the breed. So this is, again, the air that people are breathing within the 17th, 18th, and increasingly within the 19th century. Galton's racial theories were rooted in a persistent fear of racial decline that threatened superior races and the entire human species. But racial degeneration could refer to just about anything. If you're an alcoholic, that's a sign of racial degeneracy. You have tuberculosis, racial degeneracy. Venereal diseases, racial degeneracy too. And so everything within the society social problems begin to be named as racial problems, as inherent to people's biology, rather than something that is going on within the society to make things not work correctly. Real quick, a major sort of breakthrough in racial theorizing came on the heels of Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species. And this is not necessarily because Darwin was doing race theory, but for a whole long time, people were talking about race, but they couldn't figure out why it was biological. People are doing all this research, but there's no science, the science wasn't strong. So then you have Darwin, who's talking about how non-human species change over time, and race theorists say, aha, that's it. Some people are evolving faster than others, some races are not evolving fast enough, and so that's really where the language of survival of the fittest comes from. It's from racial theorists taking Darwin's theory and applying it to the social manifestation. And so race theorizing was a dynamic process in which academics and aristocrats systematized the wider public's attitudes and beliefs about race. So, one of the things that people critique is, well, if you only look at the great historical writers, you're really not going to know what are the little people sort of doing. You can't always trace things through the people that write, because not everybody is literate, not everybody has certain access, etc. But what was happening within this time period is that all of this science was being translated into popular culture, travel journals. You could go to plays about racial degeneracy. Magazine articles, very popular magazine articles. Books like Jekyll and Hyde or Robinson Crusoe. So you have children's books that are beginning to articulate this stuff. Postcards. So all the theorizing begins to saturate the rest of the society so that this becomes a concern not just for scientists and anatomists, but for people living kind of in the everyday. One of the things that I found is that they used to use horse breeding books to explain to people what was going on with race. So you're getting every sort of aspect of the culture beginning to think in a certain way. And this begins to influence how people think about how their society is organized. It begins to think about how the state sees itself and how people begin to see the state. And so as the modern period kind of progressed and the Enlightenment moved on, there was what historians call the Romantic period, which is pretty funny because it's not lovey at all. And what Romantic thinkers did was they, quote, called for the state to be driven by common purpose of a people, sharing a common ancestry, and thus a single destiny. And so thinkers across Europe began writing works demonstrating that the blood of the people is what determines the rise or the fall of the state. So you have people doing racial theories, everybody's scared of their race or all of humanity becoming extinct. We don't want to interracially breed. We don't want to have people too close to one another. There's diseases, there's this, that, and next. And so these thinkers begin to say, okay, we need to pay attention to who is within our borders, who is within our group. Where are the threats from the inside and where are the threats from the outside as they're thinking about the state policy, state development, and how to conceive of themselves as a people, and shared in common ancestry and the importance of blood in determining how we think about this group of people living together. There's a book called Race, the History of an Idea in the West, and the author observes how race dominated political language and thought after Darwin's theory of evolution. From 1842 and 1859, there was a movement that treated political activity as subject to the same rules of evolution that applied to the natural biological world. The nation becomes a natural phenomenon, and this affects state policies and practices throughout the West and its colonies. So there are some people who begin calling on the state to stop interfering in the evolutionary process and to allow inferior races to become extinct. They advocated extreme but necessary measures like ending social services for the weak, for the poor, curtailing their reproductive capacity through sterilization and castration, and other forms of state policies to make sure that these people who are weaker in our society don't bring down the entire society with their biological and unfixable weaknesses. It was in 1919 that a cluster of European nations then began passing premarital examination laws and sterilization laws aimed at maintaining racial purity. So there's sort of a negative kind of spin on how the state needs to deal with all of these different races and the threat that they pose. And then there's more of a quote-unquote positive spin where people say, okay, what we really need is some social programs to at least try and not make this so bad. There's a whole lot of weak people, but we want to prevent the inferior types from becoming the majority. We don't want to kill them off, we don't want to castrate them, we just want to make sure that they don't become the majority. And so out of this, there becomes the message that women are responsible for birthing the next generation of racially superior soldiers, colonizers, and leaders, and there's a real aim to get women fit to produce the next generation of superior racial people. And out of that, school nutrition programs get developed. So, we think school nutrition programs, that's good. We got to feed people. But the first school nutrition programs come out of this very strong fear of racial degenerating and a desire to make sure that the people who are fit remain as fit as possible to keep producing the next generation of superior folks. Female and child labor becomes restricted. So, laws trying to make sure that women and children in Europe aren't being overworked. We like that, 40-hour work week. That comes out of a racial fear. Compulsory education. People have to go to school. That comes out of a racial fear and a desire to make sure that the best of the best are remaining the best for the next generation. Now, there are a couple really other specific things, too, I want to point to of how this changes how the state begins to function and the nation state begins to think of itself. And one of those things was to mask economic inequality. So as I said, there's a lot of stuff going on during this period, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century, particularly the 18th and 19th century. And so there's industrialization, there's advances in technology, there's the rise of global trade, there's capitalist competition happening. And so pre-modern life, it begins to implode. The way that people lived before, with this rapid sort of move forward in the 18th and 19th century, that begins to disintegrate. And so, one of the perhaps unexpected things that also happens is poverty and crime explode. You have people in slums all over Europe, and people are trying to figure out what's happening. Why is crime and poverty and all of this madness sort of happening at this time? But instead of blaming the economic system for the turn of events, why would we blame that? We like capitalism. People begin to associate overcrowding cities and the spread of disease and the rising alcoholism with biological inferiority of the lower class. So you have an Italian criminologist saying things that, criminals are a subhuman species. They have particular physical features. If you just look for them, they have innate moral deficiencies and an uncontrollable natural desire to harm others. And so they're not just savage men, but they're the most ferocious carnivores and rodents. That's a quote. They're not really human. All of these people who are doing these things, it's not capitalism, it's not industrialization, it's not technology. These people have a biological deficiency that needs to be decreased. And so there are species of bloodthirsty beasts. The poor and people who commit crimes are categorized in that way. The poor are seen as primitive savages who are violent, sexually promiscuous, and morally corrupt. And it was to the extent where one French scholar actually gave them a racial category. They're the Alpines. They're not Saxons, they're not Celts, all of these poor people doing stuff that they shouldn't. We have classified them as another race entirely. And so they should be dealt with as such. And so by racializing economic inequality, the elite not only explain why these people are so down low all of a sudden, they explain why they're so high up. It's not my fault. I just happen to be born with a hereditary biological thing that makes me smarter, that makes me able to sort of rise to the cream of the crop. It's not because of the systems that we've put in place, but because I am a part of a superior race, and so I'm not responsible for exploiting anybody else. That's how the problem is resolved. Now, some people's response, like I said, was to just do whatever it takes to make sure these people die out eventually. But another interesting response was to give more social programs, more social help. And the way that they explained it is because the workers were identifying with each other across borders. So you have poor people and you have the people who are committing crimes and people who are being crushed by the emerging economic system that is happening within the modern period. And so they begin to say, wow, hey, workers over there are experiencing the same thing. And workers across the ocean are experiencing the same thing. And workers in the country next door. And so people's allegiances begin to tie closer to workers who are in their same condition versus the state that they're a part of. And so you have people maybe trying to figure out how to organize or how to learn from each other to form networks with each other. And the state sees this as a problem because it's beginning, blood is important, shared ancestry is important. What we want to do is put a cap on this geographic location and everybody who lives here. You don't want people making friends with who knows who from some other place that might be dangerous. And so one of the things that the state does is to institute some social programs. Medical insurance, unemployment insurance, pensions, government aid. All of these things then become used to sort of pacify people. And we think, I'm not saying, medical insurance, Sweden is doing pretty good, where medical insurance might be a good thing. People get sick and you go to the hospital. But where is it coming from? What is the driving force that makes the state think that this might be necessary? And one of the driving forces is race and a fear of racial degeneracy and a fear of other people. So it's not benevolent. It doesn't start out being benevolent in any way. And so you give these workers and the people in the lower class just enough to keep them from sort of noticing each other other places and to begin coalescing allegiance around the government that provides them with good things. Now, another thing that sort of emerges is how do we determine citizenship? It's maybe a little recognized fact that it wasn't since time immemorial that people had to have passports or green cards. Like people really used to be able to move relatively freely from territory to territory up to a certain point in history. You have family over there, everybody might travel together, it's not a big deal, the borders aren't really maintained with any kind of stringency. But as fear and panic over supposed signs of racial degeneration spread, and international competition increases, emerging nations feel a greater need to preserve and enhance their strength. And so one of the ways to achieve this goal was to create legal and political barriers to limit the influence of weaker races. So in 1858, you have Abraham Lincoln publicly arguing against allowing black races to be political and social equals with whites. You don't want them influencing how your state functions and how your national processes go. They're a weaker race. They're not going to be here forever anyway. After the Civil War, southern states continued to disenfranchise the Negroes. So, people the Emancipation Proclamation gets signed. People really like to herald Lincoln, but I'll move back for a little while for just a second to note here that he actually had the idea, even though he hated slavery, he was so certain that darker races would remain inferior and unequal to whites biologically, that he explored the possibility of colonizing Negroes outside the United States. You need their labor. They're going to disappear anyway. We don't really want them inside. Slavery's kind of bad. But they're never going to be able to contribute in any significant way. So can we at least get their labor and all that kind of stuff from somewhere where they're not going to pollute the people, the superior races that are within the borders of the country? And so, you have, and some of this will be familiar to anybody who has done a history class with some professor that has a conscience. After the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation, there continues to be disenfranchisement. And so you have people using poll taxes, literacy tests, property restrictions, et cetera, to try and limit how much these weaker dying out races, how much influence, even though they're free, can have on the social system. Now, a similar thing is happening in Europe with the Jewish situation, because before the modern period, anti-Jewish persecution was rooted in bad theology, as Christians attacked and discriminated against Jews for rejecting the Messiah. But after race was invented, theorists, like I said, begin to describe Jews as a different race, biologically and physiologically distinct from European races. They have different physical characteristics, and all of a sudden the term Jew refers to a fixed racial condition instead of a cultural or a religious life. And so within Europe, it also becomes the process of determining citizenship. You know, Jews, they're an inferior race, and what's worse is we can't really tell them as different from other races. They have the same skin color as us. Maybe they have a few facial features if you look close, but they're sneaky. You know, they can infiltrate. That's the language that begins to be constructed around them. And so citizenship for them also becomes restricted. You want to limit the kind of influence that they will have on your national policy and the way that your state runs, because, you know, they might pollute everything. They're an internal threat, and an internal racial threat that they can't change because it's biology. And the other quick thing, too, which has a lot of relevance to what's going on with the immigration situation now, is the maintenance of borders. So just as race determines which residents could be citizens of the nation, it also decides which foreigners can come inside of the nation's borders. And so immigration law is a distinctly modern construction that came into being in the midst of late 19th century panic over racial degeneration, the ascendance of social Darwinism, and international competition for economic and racial and geographic power. And so America develops its first immigration laws in response to the influx of Chinese labor that came into California and other western states in 1849. One person who opposed their immigration said that morally the Chinese are the most debased people on the face of the earth. Their touch is pollution, and harsh as the opinion may seem, justice to our own race demands that they should never settle on our soil. In the 1870s, resistance to Chinese immigration culminated in public protests and even several lynchings. And so as different groups tried to come in, once they've been sort of assigned a racial category of weakness, the same kind of language happened. So, you know, Italians used to be considered black, and so they were treated as such. Irish used to be considered black. And, you know, immigration laws, all in a flurry. How can we make sure they don't come in here? They come in here anyway. How can we make sure that they don't have influence, et cetera, et cetera? And so with the nation, there's a real consolidation, a real trying to push an allegiance between certain kinds of people. And others coming from the outside are a threat to that. Your borders get stricter. Who can be a citizen gets stricter. How you talk about economic distinctions becomes less about what is socially happening, more about what is racially happening. And, you know, there are other markers of the nation state emerging out of this kind of theorizing that is happening during this time. And so that's to say that a lot of this stuff isn't neutral. You know, it always after doing this, it kind of always gets me when people are like, wow, we got to write to our Congress people and say that those immigration laws are unfair. You know, we got to let somebody know. And I'm like, that's the way that they've always been. I mean, that's the point. That's the purpose that they serve. Your congressman doesn't, you know, he knows what he's doing. The system and the state knows what it's doing. And we might talk about it as culture, and we might talk about it as like, well, they speak a different language from us, you know, people aren't as blatant as they used to be. But really what it is the same underlying fear of who is going to come in here and undermine us as a superior body of people. And so we need to look at some of the things that we have as not being neutral, whether it's medical insurance or food programs or those kinds of things. And when people talk about structural racism, that's how deep we're trying to get at it. It's built into the way that we organize ourselves, and we can't not pay attention to that if we're going to get somewhere. So now that I've depressed everybody's throat.
Amen.
Oh, thank you. What might possibly, potentially give us a little bit of help, particularly as Christians? Nations built as they are on the premise of a natural unity within and a fear of inherently distinct pollutants from without will invariably be governed by racism in some form. As long as the state is thinking of itself in this way, and I can't see that it's going to plan to unthink of itself in that way, as long as we are organizing ourselves as America and France and Germany, we're going to be governed by some kind of fear of polluting from the inside, some kind of fear of polluting from the outside, and racism is going to be a part of that mix in some form. And so in so much as schools, laws, social welfare programs, and other national institutions exist to make people into good citizens and loyal patriots, they too will be saturated with racist ideologies and racist practices. And so in light of this understanding of race and nation, I believe that people who are working to dismantle racism must also find ways to resist the logic and the mythology and the politics of the nation state. And integral to this resistance are individuals and communities that derive their identity and purpose outside of the nation. And so as a follower of Jesus, who is also anarchist, I believe that the church, and I want to say this, when rightly ordered, can be the kind of community that challenges the racism of the nation state. And I'm not saying that other forms of anti-racist action are not effective or important, but I just wanted to try and highlight for myself and for the readers of this essay and for you all some resources perhaps within the Christian faith that can support this struggle. The church, when rightly ordered, can be the kind of community that challenges the racism of the nation state and the way that it is structured and it's ordered and it's so insidious. And part of that comes by reclaiming an identity that Christians, particularly in this country, but other places as well, are so welcome and easy to give up. I'm an American first, maybe a Christian 31st. And so trying to point to some of those issues. By constantly aligning itself with empires and democracies, with kings and czars, with tyrants and presidents, Christians have willingly blessed, participated in, and instigated genocide, slavery, war, etc., etc. But in spite of the church's widespread unfaithfulness, including its practices of racism and nation building, I think the relevance and transformative power of our mission remains the same. Christians are called to be living testimonies to the upside-down kingdom of God, in which our primary vocations are love of God and love of neighbor. We are called to be a community that is reconciled to God and to one another, and that proclaims triumph over the oppressive powers of this world. We are called to be a community that includes strangers and enemies in the list of neighbors to whom we show patient love and generous hospitality. We are called to the work of Jesus, who was anointed to bring good news to the poor, release to the captives, etc., etc. And one of the things that I think that we forget is, number one, that the church is a transnational political body. We don't think of ourselves in that way. We've become very provincial in how we conceive of what the church is. But if we think that the church is universal, then that means that we are connected to the past. It means we are connected to the present. It means that we are connected upwards. It means that we are connected to people regardless of whether they're located. And if that's our primary agenda and our primary identity, that should confuse other people. and it should change how we relate in the world. I want to look at one scripture text, and then I will pass it on to Layla, who I have asked to give a 10-minute response, first to some of the things that I've said. We are good conversation partners, and I'm honored to have her do that. And then we will open up for questions, discussion, etc., etc. So while I was writing this essay, I decided to look at the book of Acts. So we find this resurrected Jesus visiting with his disciples before departing from the earth. And Jesus assures his followers that they will be given the power of the Holy Spirit so that they can be his witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth. And so there's a particular section of the text in which on the day of Pentecost, the Spirit envelops all the disciples. A commotion sort of happens because these ordinary Galileans are speaking about God's work in multiple languages. And they're all hearing in their own language. And so you have people from all over the empire. There's a long list of Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, etc. You have people from all of these different parts of the empire who, by the power of the Holy Spirit, begin to hear the same message, but in their own language and from their own context. And so I was trying to think about how can we think about this event that's happening in Acts in relationship to some of the stuff about confusion about our identity in relationship to the nation state and how we become co-opted and how this text might be pointing to a different way of thinking about ourselves. Now, first, the event affirms that the church is a political as well as a spiritual body that stands in contrast to that of the governing powers. Each of the groups present in the crowd, as I said, was a part of the Roman Empire, which was united by bureaucracy, by coercion, and when necessary, violence. It's not too dissimilar from the context that we're in. But unlike the Roman state, the Holy Spirit empowers the disciples to unite the crowd through language, testimony, and sign. So it's a different kind of calling together of people. And in so doing, the disciples followed Jesus' refusal to use the kingdoms of this world to carry out God's vision. And so while the Roman Empire was coercing everybody, is using bureaucracy and using violence, the Acts text points to another kind of scenario in which the Holy Spirit is bringing people together from where they are, from disparate locations, in the language and the context that they understand, not through coercion, not through violence, but through testimony and through sign and through language. And second, I think that the Pentecost miracle can be seen as an equalizing event. And although the text is not explicit, one can imagine that in a crowd in which more than 3,000 people are present, probably includes men and women, children, upper, lower class, as well as people from across the empire. And since each one heard the disciples speaking in the native language of each, it is very plausible that all the people were privileged to hear the word of God, regardless of their gender or their age or their status in the society. So you have something that is happening that is not dependent on socially constructed categories that the empire gives to people. Everybody can hear this from their own location without coercion and violence, regardless of gender and age and their status in the society. It is a that calls everybody together. People are not forced. I think what's also interesting is that the crowd isn't forced to speak and hear in one language. So, there is the way that the miracle could have gone in which everybody hears in one language. But there is the maintenance of the divergence of languages. And I think that this is in stark contrast to a nation which expects conformity to a shared, albeit superficial identity, and marks inequalities with a tenuous unity, and tolerates diversity only that does not threaten its power or cohesion. So this is happening in people's different languages rather than God saying, okay, everybody's going to hear my message and great. And that is a distinction between how the nation state functions and how the church, I think, is being pointed to functioning. And what's also particularly important is that this event leads to a particular kind of lifestyle in which reconciled people from different places gather together, they share their goods, they live in common, regardless of what these other divisions are asking them to be to one another. There's slave, there's free, there's no Jew or Greek, there's no Gentile, it's everybody coming together then after this sort of miraculous kind of event, and a new community is formed that stands in contrast to what is being presented by the empire, to what is available through the Roman Empire. And so I think this understanding of the early Christian community exemplifies Paul's words to the Philippians that our true citizenship or our true commonwealth is not of this world. It's from a different place. And for this reason, the church must resist all temptations to continue switching the two. Our identity is really, really important. And we can't continue to keep getting sucked in to the way that the nation continues to define itself, or playing these games where we want to be American first, or this other thing first, etc., etc. We are a transnational political body, and that means that I am responsible as somebody who holds the faith to somebody who holds the faith in Iraq, and even to people who don't hold the faith because they're my neighbors, to the people in Afghanistan, to the people, etc., etc. I mean, I think it's appalling that people are like, wow, I didn't know there were Christians in, Syria. Well, that's a problem. I mean, a problem of not watching the news, but also just a problem of not understanding who the church is and what it's called to be and what kind of body it's supposed to be. So I will stop with that.
Well, I'm Leila, so wonderful presentation, a lot of important points. We have such a good conversations face to face. Responding in this context kind of makes it more official, but I would like to point out to the fact that the problems of race, constructing the other as a racial category, is something that Nekeisha actually also touched upon in her previous presentations in the past, that's connected to also constructing us as a separate species from the world. And in the end, this whole very intricate problem that she so brilliantly, exposed the tiny bolts and mechanisms of how it works. The larger question comes into the fact how we choose to live, what we choose to eat, and therefore how we know the world, how we know ourselves, and how we know the other. How it comes into race and poverty and structures of nation-states, empires, and hierarchy, capitalism, all these systems, is the fact that the minute you perceive the other as your rightful resource, you are going to do everything to consume that person's lifetime, and being. You have to control everything. You have to domesticate everything about that person. And that extends to animals, to plants, and to people. So, I recently came across a very interesting biblical scholar, Christian Hayes, and she actually pointed me into the direction that originally in the Old Testament, the human beings were created with the animals on the sixth day. And God gave specific directions of what each is going to eat. And it was not going to be each other. It was going to be vegetables, doesn't mention vegetables, but plants and seeds and grass and leaves for everyone, so there would be no competition between my creatures that I create. All of you are my creatures. So it's interesting that deciding to go against the prohibitions and the prescriptions of God, people basically end up with the punishment, which is agriculture. And from then on, that's domestication. That's when you begin to perceive that you can have power over your food and you can eat somebody else, whether literally or metaphorically. But in the end, it all builds into this system, this structure that is so well thought of and has, thousands of years behind it. And we face this really difficult task of how to overcome our knowledge of ourselves as the consumers. Because even in this hierarchy, each of us occupies a niche when we can eat somebody else. We can eat somebody else's time, somebody else's effort. Technology we buy, the food, the clothes we wear, we don't make it. Somebody makes it. Somebody destroys, takes it away from the animals. Wild animals are destroyed. Domesticated animals are constructed in this system of oppression, and it has become really so global and so sophisticated that it's very difficult to find a way to dismantle it. And I believe that finding out more about this mechanism and making our own personal choices of how we're going to know the other is what is going to give us hope. There are interesting points, for example, Nekeisha mentioned on control of movement, the borders, nation-state, construction of the inferior races that haven't developed as well as us. In today's laws, and actually very recently, 50, 60 years ago, in the United States, immigration, there's a very good researcher, Stephen J. Gould, and he wrote The Mismeasure of Man. He's a microbiologist. And he connects how, his studies in microbiology, paleontology, and sociology, how we construct the other, for example. IQ testing were part of the immigration criteria for immigrants from all over the place, including Europe. And like Nekeisha said, Europeans were rated differently, and it's very interesting how, for example, the Scandinavians didn't speak English well, so they didn't do very well on the written part, because, and the Italians didn't do very well on the written part. But the Scandinavians was it's because, they speak a different language. Whereas, say, the Italians or the Romanians or, the Jews coming from Russia or Russians or, well, it's because, they're inferior. Then they decided to make it like people have to recognize paintings and to see how intelligent they are. So they would draw, for example, a shape like this, And a shape like this would mean a roof only in specific cultures that build houses with roofs like that. If you come, from Africa where you build a roof like this, or from a place where you build straight roofs, this wouldn't mean a roof to you, it might mean something else. But this was all, cultural recognition was also taken to construct the other. And again, the ultimate question was, why? There were laws, civilization laws, for example, in California, very interesting research by Natalia Moliner on the role of medical institutions and doctors in constructing race so as not to permit inferior races like Mexicans and Japanese and Chinese to own land in California. So it was a very specific way of using, even the knowledge of the health of the other person, controlling that health, making that person unhealthy because you're not allowing them to move and to eat, and using that against them to prove that theory. And the reason I'm mentioning all that is just to make this point that we all are part of this structure. Somewhere we all have to comply with these laws. And things get mixed up and they're not as clear anymore. For example, Kellogg's cornflakes. Kellogg invented cornflakes in order for the poor races to stop reproducing, or to control the reproduction, because apparently it's supposed to make these cornflakes are supposed to make the poor people sterile. And at the same time, these poor people are necessary, they're important. We can't kill them all because we need them. Because anything in this structure that we have is at the expense of them. You kill them, you can't eat them. You can't consume their time, their labor, their effort. So, how are we going to overcome these everyday realities that you go to the store and sometimes Kellogg's is the only thing that some people can afford? They get it, it's easy. But that's what's behind it. Even if it's scientifically true or not true, it's part of that structure of knowing the other, knowing the animal, knowing the person, knowing, this world. And, basically, tomorrow we'll be picking up, we'll have more time to talk about, the possibilities of resisting the system. But this is what I wanted to draw your attention to, and my response to this.
So I guess I will also moderate. I guess if people have questions or brief questions or brief comments. We have somebody who already has a comment. I'm going to choose you, but one of the things that I should say about my moderation is that I like to give, because there are voices that are excluded in so many other settings, if there are women or people of color or people from other kind of underrepresented groups who do raise their hand at some point in the question and answer period, I like to move them up in the stack. So hopefully that's not a problem for anybody. Go ahead, my friend.
Yeah, so that was a profoundly US-centric look at racism and so on. Do you have anything to say about maybe particularly Asian views of race and what they have constructed, especially, because they're Koreans and Japanese and Chinese and stuff as well.
Yeah.
Do you have anything about that?
I do take a very European kind of look at it, in part because the essay was published in Europe, but also because it seems like there's where the the idea germinates where it springs from, that particular kind of context. But I think that there are similar things at play. I mean, just anecdotally, my sister went to China, and, you know, like there is just a huge, there's an intrigue of people of color, but also a very strong resistance to be anything like that. So one of the biggest popular, one of the most popular products is whitening cream for Chinese people, which is sort of ridiculous. And so I would not be surprised if some of the same kind of dynamics were at play, but I shouldn't be quoted on that. Why don't you press?
A lot of those whitening creams were actually toxic.
Mm-hmm.
My question was kind of in response to that. I've been reading a lot on kind of black theology out of the 70s,
Mm-hmm.
as well as early feminist theology and liberation theology. And one of the things that I've kind of, as a white male, been seeing a lot of is kind of the, how do I say, basically leave us the hell alone response. And I'm curious kind of what your thought is on that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, is the appropriate response for me as a white male to basically shut up and go away? Or is there a more, from your perspective, a more productive way that I can be an ally without necessarily taking a position which should appropriately be filled by someone else?
Mm-hmm. Well, the one thing that I would say is that, number one, it obviously depends on who you talk to. And if somebody does say, leave us the hell alone, then I think that it's important to respect that. I wouldn't necessarily say it that way. But what I do think, what I have seen and sort of do think, like particularly in groups like these, or people who, Christians in particular, who want to sort of be on the side of the oppressed or in solidarity, the impulse is to run to the ghettos, to run to the inner cities. We're going to do intentional community and that kind of thing in the place where the least of the least are. And that's not necessarily, I mean, if it's done poorly, it's very problematic. But I'm wondering when there's going to be like a cater of people who want to run to the suburbs, or run to the parents, or start doing anti-racism work, because and I mean I say that kind of flippantly, but like I might not have always had language for what I'm talking about, but ever since I came to the U.S. and was defined by black, I understand racism. And to a certain extent, I don't always know what people are going to teach me, coming from the outsider or white perspective. But it sure would be nice if somebody helped teach other white people about racism and about structural racism, and not just like, well, I'm really nice and I have people of color friends. Like, I would really like for somebody to start doing service work there. And so that might be, I would think that was a really good ally thing to do, because people don't always listen to me. I become an angry black woman real fast if I raise my tone. But somebody might listen to you. And Mara has a quick point too.
Yeah, quick point actually in response to both of you. One is that, the structural, the structure of racism is done so that even if you as a white male, have the best intentions, are doing actually and sacrificing and doing a lot, the way the structure of oppression responds to you is ultimately going to be different, and actually you're going to score points on being the good white male. Look at, some of us are so conscientious, pat on the shoulder, go and suffer. Okay, coming from me or Nekeisha, it's not the same. It's always against us. Oh, another angry black woman. Oh, just get over it. So, it's very difficult to say what to do when the structure itself. My response would be just undo the consumption. Who and how and what you eat in all the senses. And that would probably be more effective than, and each one has their own response, and I think they're all valid, but the response to your response is not equal, and that is the problem. As quickly to, because I'm familiar with racism outside the white, I grew up most of my life in Africa, and from my experience is that racism is a problem of domestication. It's not the fact that, well, white people oppress. Some white people have constructed a system that is so efficient that everybody, even the Irish who are the blacks of Europe, still profit from it. Because they have a worse niche, but they still have it when everyone else doesn't. But it's a problem of civilization and domestication that every society, the minute they enter into the scope that I am going to consume the other, they're going to do it. And it's going to be darker races going against lighter races, lighter races going... I mean, it could be anything. It could be language. There's Mary Douglas, an anthropologist, who's just like, about what you eat is taken against you. Okay, you know, you eat that, so I can abuse you because you're not clean. It could be anything. You know, so the structure of oppression and alienation is about the mentality of consumption. And it's everywhere where there is domestication, and it's not there where there is wilderness, that is, people or animals believe that the other exists for their own or for the divine sake, whichever you choose to think.
Okay, Wes, and then here, and then over here. Go ahead.
I'm going to ask about something else, but I'll just respond to your invitation. As Jonathan and Layla knows, they stayed at our house last night. We've long ago taken up your invitation to do the most difficult ministry I know, which is in suburbia. It's much easier to be in the inner city, much easier than in suburbia, where people thank you for, you know, I don't know if you know Nekeisha Alexis, who's a Native American writer who's in our area in Seattle. He said, you know, white liberals think they've done something against racism if a person of color tells them how racist they are. And they saw them at the meeting and heard it. See how good I am? Because I'm willing to have a person of color tell me I'm racist. So, and I didn't yell at them. I didn't argue with them. Sorry, I was liberal. So being in that context, where people are glad at some level to receive chastisement for their oppression, and that feels like therefore they've done something, feeds into the system of, you know, punishment and etc. So it's a very difficult context, but that's where we are. The question I was going to ask you about is, you start, you know, the event here is in the beginning, and you chose to start after the beginning. And I'm wondering how much is at stake for you in that. You know, you went back to the Bible, and as you obviously know, and I'm sure most of us do, that maybe not the category of race as we understand it in the English language word race, but certainly, as Layla's point, could be othering of people as ancient.
Right.
So what's at stake for you in starting at that particular point?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that seems to be different about kind of the othering that happens pre-development of this category is that there is, to a certain extent, possibility of moving from one category to another. And so maybe if an other adopts our way of doing things, maybe that it might be something that they do, but it isn't who they are in a way that is intractable, it feels like. I mean, and I might be wrong about that.
Well, let's just take one example. I don't want to dominate this, maybe other people have other questions, but just to throw one situation I know it's going to address tonight, so you know. Take the example of Joseph in Egypt, Genesis. So Joseph works for Pharaoh. He marries an Egyptian wife. He names his kids Egyptian, but Pharaoh won't eat with him because he's a Hebrew. So even after that, Pharaoh won't eat with him.
Right.
So he can't become an Egyptian, really.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I would say that to some extent, the fact that it is biological feels sort of different for me. I mean, and that might not be the case, but that there is so much invested in making a case that I am deformed not because of my cultural practices or because of the gods that I serve or something that is external and held, but that is intrinsic. There is something within my body that I can't control in any way, shape, or form that makes me worthy of sterilization and castration and extinction. That feels like a new thing. And this is a relatively new area of research for me, so I am open to challenge, but it's sort of the sort of research that I did kind of pointed to that being new. It's not something that I do, it's who I am internally that makes me a problem. But we'll go here.
So you used the phrase church rightly ordered,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm in Suburbia living in a Christian community. It's confusing what we're doing. So trying to figure out how do we be the church rightly ordered with a bunch of people who, at least when we initially encounter them, are in their own selves not rightly ordered. So how do we create communities that are safe and liberated? What does it look like to rightly order, especially for people of color to come in and to have space, as well as being learning space? Because the default for anybody who is educated in this culture is to be not rightly ordered when it comes to race and gender or things like that. Do you have a picture of what that looks like?
Do I have a picture? What have mercy? If I had a picture, I would have taken something over already. I mean, I think some of it goes, and this might be particular to the American context, but I think it plays itself out other places differently as well. So, just to do a quick story, I was in Sweden last year, and the biggest problem that Christians have is trying to figure out where they fit in the society, because the society is so good. Free healthcare, free this, free that, and it's easy to be apathetic. What does a Christian look like in a context when the government is so nice? So some of the things that I have said is like, well, where are people, or some of the things that they're doing is finding the cracks. So Sweden is really nice, but it's very individualistic. I think 60% of people live by themselves, like alone. And so they're trying to form community, and that looks very strange. These people that worship together and live together and it's not even a matter of blood relative, they live together. That's bizarre. And so finding ways of taking things that are true of who Jesus calls us to be and modeling that in the spaces where we find ourselves. The sort of sin of nationalism. I mean, I don't think we have to worry about that here. We're in an anarchist gallery. But I think that even when people want to step away from it, they still want to hold it very close. Like the kind of American entitlement that we are safe and we are better, et cetera, and how our churches are so trapped in that. That even when we're trying to be really socially active, we're not willing to go to that place where we're willing to give sanctuary to illegal immigrants, because they're our brothers and sisters, they're our neighbors. And I think that'd be a pretty radical thing to do. That would get your church in trouble in a hurry. And so what are some of the issues that are kind of happening in spaces that are pushing you to be unrightly ordered, whether it's consumerism or self-focus, or what are some of the things that you're seeing within your context in suburbia? It might play itself differently somewhere else. And then, can we name that and figure out what the right ordering will be of our desire, of our actions, et cetera, et cetera. That's really vague, but I really do think that it plays out differently in different places. So hopefully that's of some help.
I have a question on Christian anarchist theology's role in kind of interfaith anarchist vision.
Yeah. Yeah.
Especially coming as a Buddhist anarchist.
Yeah. Well, I think it goes back to two of the primary rules is love of God and love of neighbor. And loving other people means that we don't kill them and we don't oppress them and we don't, that Acts stories, we don't force, God is not forcing people into something in that story in the same way that the Roman Empire forces people. One language, one system, one coin, one all this stuff. People are hearing in a message that is true to who they are. For me, I see other people who, as allies, like I think that the Spirit animates and rejuvenates not only in my neck of the woods, but all over the place. Like our theology is such that all of it belongs to the Creator, and that the Creator is involved in writing everything and bringing reconciliation and shalom, and that sometimes we have coworkers that are not necessarily the people that we would think are coworkers, and that we need to keep our eyes and ears open to that. I think certainly again, when rightly practiced, the church just doesn't do a very good job of it, at least not an institutional church. You can always find kind of niches through the history. But I think if we do and love in the way that we're supposed to, and we have an identity that is truer, then and there will be places where we disagree. And I'm really not down for when people are like, well, you're just a Christian in disguise. There are people who try and pull that stuff too that I think is disingenuous. That you can be an authentic coworker and we're working for some of the same things, and I articulated and believe differently about it, but I'm certainly not going to be like, well, you can't play because, you don't play my tune. Whoa. Oh dear. Okay. I saw a hand there and a hand there and a hand there. Is that a hand or a arm?
Oh no,
It's an elbow. Very good. Okay. Okay. I'm gonna do 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. Okay. A 6. Okay. Go ahead.
So a lot of your work seems to be around research and history, and I was just wondering if you could talk a bit about remembering as resistance, and especially as it relates to race, and like the importance of knowing history and taking that journey yourself and encouraging others to take that journey of remembering.
Yeah.
You repeat your question?
Oh, say it louder.
I was just kind of asking her about the importance of remembering and resistance, and how knowing history kind of liberates you, frees you to fight oppression.
Well, I think one of the things is that some of this goes to doing our own work. That sort of how, not just the sort of remembering of this stuff that we don't really pay attention to when we're trying to engage in the struggle against oppression, but also our own location in this and how we have been formed differently. As a woman of color, immigrant from Trinidad with a particular kind of history, how I remember and how I activate is going to be different than somebody who is an African American with their own history, which is different than somebody who is an Irish American with their own history, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that race does, particularly with white people, is that it strips them of cultural history. All of a sudden, all of these diverse groups with different languages, different cultures, all of that stuff gets condensed down into the category of white. And so there's anti-racism training that I've participated in twice, where there's always this exercise where the people say, okay, everybody, we're going to put you in categories, and you might resist the categories a little, but it's the category that society has given you. and tell me what's good about being you. You know, when people of color are like, oh, I like my hair, and I like our food, and oh, I like this thing and that thing, and I can talk to people, and I can move in space this way, and Hispanic people are writing their thing, and the white people are always like, I have to be white? Yes. I can't be Swiss German? No. I like going to the bank and not having people stare at me. I like that police officers give me directions without beating me down. You know what I mean? And so people get mad at the exercise, like, oh, I've been set up, you know, but what the exercise is trying to get at is I'm not setting you up, the system of race has set you up. What does it mean to be an Irish person? Do people here with Irish background understand their history? Did you know that you used to be black? Would that give you a different kind of outlook if you did? You know, and so not only remembering is sort of really trying to understand what has happened, where we have ended up, but remembering in terms of how I have ended up where I am and how each other person has ended up where they are. Because self-liberation is also part of group liberation. You can't have one without the other if it's going to be sustainable. So I'll put that out there. And then Jocelyn, and there, and there. Okay. Mm-hmm.
I used to say that one of the most segregated days of the week is Sunday morning.
Yep.
And how can someone engage in a conversation in their own congregation around race, and what experiences you have in small groups or in going to your pastor and saying, you know, can we, you know, have a discussion after service
Right.
about race and faith
Mm-hmm.
and challenge the race based on.
Right. Well, I think some of it has to do with noticing and noticing aloud. So I don't want to knock any church or whatever, but you know, in the Mennonite church, a lot of times people will put up the photos of all the members. Oh, how exciting! You know, and it's sort of like I might notice under my breath, there's some people of color here. But you know, can somebody in that congregation say, hey, there's no people of color here? Like, what's going on? Or why is it that we're like right down the street from these other people and we never worship together? Or why don't we only worship together on Martin Luther King Jr. Day and we have Black Day? Can we do this like every month? And so my experience has been primarily within like the seminary where I work. It's sort of pointing out some of these things and sort of saying, you claim to have a particular mission. That's really good. If you can call people on the mission that they have already put out there into the universe as being theirs. You know, if your church has a particular vision for itself, can you use that to sort of say, yeah, hey, we have this vision. How are we going to talk about race as part of this vision? I mean, that's basically what I've been trying to do in the institutions that I've been a part of. You know, they're all like, Christ for all creation. And I'm like, wow, and this is how your organization is set up. Who's at the top, who's at the bottom, et cetera, et cetera. So some of it is remembering, and some of it is noticing and being public in the noticing. Why is this the way that this is? Can we talk about it? I can go into some more details, but I mean, certainly when I was at both of my organizations, that's what it was. I'm like, why are we writing this way? Can we talk about that? So yeah. We're going to have to wrap up when other people start coming upstairs, but since nobody's coming upstairs yet, we're going to keep going. Keep going. Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to highlight, I guess, and pull out some things that you were saying that made a lot of sense to me or that I heard in the way that I heard them. And one is thinking about the nation being founded on this drive for strength and health and being able to overcome, and thinking that I could ask myself, where do I have a fear of weakness? What is my idea of health? Where is my idea of health backwards?
Mm-hmm.
That we have this idea of what's healthy and typically accepted by society. I think that's something we can all question. And a lot of communities I've encountered, I feel like communities to accept people where they are, because the way that the spirit accepts us, the junk that we have, or
Mm-hmm.
just starting there. And also
seems like it wants to amalgamate us all into, or assimilate us all into kind of one consumer culture, one, like, I guess like post-racial type of concept where race is nothing anymore.
I hate that term.
Yeah. So, with that in mind, do you think it's possible to deconstruct the idea of the concept of race by reconstructing the concept of ethnicity, tradition, and culture? And or do you think that's something that would just kind of end up making the same mistake?
Right. I mean, I think it depends how it's done and who does it. The way that race has shifted, like some of the research that I was doing, for example, is France, which is very xenophobic. And there are a lot of other European countries too, Sweden, some of these places that are dealing with influxes of population that they're not used to are very xenophobic. And really it's constructed as culture. You know, we're just worried that these people who speak this different language are going to dilute our culture. We're just worried that they do things different than us. It happens in the U.S. too. There's this, nobody names it as race, but they do name it as being like a clash of cultures that just can't be resolved. As if somebody's culture then becomes the thing that is biological. Versus, okay, race is not really real, but culture is starting to be the language that is used to replace race. And so, I think that is very seductive because it seems very neutral, but it really, really isn't. And so, but I do think that there might be, or can be, some merit to people rediscovering who they are, who their people were, where they fit within this chain of things that have occurred. There's a film that some white caucus group on our campus has used, a white women's caucus group, where this young woman traces the trail of how her ancestors trafficked slaves in this sort of ginormous triangle, and what that process is like, and what they have to confront them. Did I really go to Harvard because I'm super smart, or am I going to Harvard because my family had this legacy and it was easier for us to get in because all of our generations got in? And so I think it depends who's using it and for what purpose it's being used. But that the state, again, is using it in a very particular way, and it's with the same implications of threat and pollution from inside and without maintaining the superiority of the race and the nation that is present. And I think I have to stop, but I can talk with you afterwards if I need to. Thank you.
Thanks, Nekeisha. Hey, everybody. So the next two sessions, downstairs is going to be on violence and nonviolence, a conversation. It's going to be really, engaging.
Violent?
No!
It's all right. I completely lost it. What you're talking about. And up here is going to be behind the blue wall. So you got.
That's the policing session. You might want to say. Is there a description in there?
Do I read it?
Oh no, I forgot if I put it there or not. Yes. Okay.
Well, I'll give you the details. Behind the blue wall is talking about police, where police fit into our society, how they act, what kind of powers are behind that. So.